I have told this story to exactly no one, in full, until now. Pieces of it, sure, the version that fits in a sentence, the version people can nod along to at a dinner table. But not the whole thing, not in order, not with all the parts that still don't quite make sense to me even though I lived every one of them. I think the order matters here, so I'm going to start at the beginning, even the boring parts, because the boring parts are where the truth was hiding the whole time. My name is Renata Ashford. I'm 34. I live in a small brick house on Larkspur Street in a mid-sized city I won't bother naming, because it could be any city, and because some of the people in this story are still walking around in it, and I'd rather they keep their privacy. I have one daughter. Her name is Josie. She is 8 years old, and until the day I'm about to tell you about, she had not taken a single step in 14 months. I should tell you how that happened, briefly, because it's the hinge the rest of this swings on. 14 months before the day in the park, my husband Daniel was driving Josie home from a friend's birthday party on a wet Tuesday evening. A delivery truck ran a light on Ferris Avenue. Daniel died at the scene. Josie's spine was injured in a way the doctors described to me with words like incomplete and T10, and we won't know the full extent for a while, which is a doctor's way of saying they don't know, and neither do you, and neither does she. She lived. That's the part one made myself say every single day for a year, sometimes out loud, alone in the kitchen, like a woman rehearsing a line she was afraid she'd forget. She lived. Everything after that was supposed to be gratitude. Some days it was. Some days it was just exhausting, in a way I still feel guilty admitting. Josie used a wheelchair. Still does, as I tell you this, most of the time. She went from a girl who ran everywhere, down hallways, across yards, straight at me with her arms out, to a girl who had to be lifted into a bath, who watched other kids play tag from 6 feet back and never asked to join, because she already knew what the answer would be and she had decided, at 7 years old, to spare herself the asking. I moved us to the house on Larkspur because it was one story, no stairs, close to Josie's school and to Whitmore Park, which had a wide paved path good for wheels and old oak trees that dropped a kind of quiet over everything. We went to that park most afternoons after school. It became our routine the way certain places become routines after a loss, not because they're special, but because they're the only place your body knows how to be still. There was a man in that park. I noticed him the way you notice weather, present, unremarkable, part of the scenery. He sat on the same bench most days, near the fountain, feeding pigeons from a paper sack he refilled from a bin behind the bakery on Kestrel Street. He wore a canvas coat that had clearly been a good coat once, years ago, the kind with a corduroy collar, gone soft and gray with wear. He had a short gray beard and eyes that looked, even from a distance, like they were doing arithmetic on something far away. Other parents steered their strollers a wide berth around him. I did too, at first. Not out of unkindness. Out of the specific, low-grade fear you carry when you're alone with a child and every stranger is a variable you haven't solved for yet. His name, I would later learn, was Walter Voss. But for the first several months I knew him only as the man on the bench, and Josie knew him the same way, except that she watched him. She watched him the way she used to watch birds before the accident, with a stillness that had nothing anxious in it, just attention, plain and open. He always gives the little ones more, she said to me once, maybe 4 months into our park routine. The bread. He gives more to the small pigeons so the big ones don't take it all first. I hadn't noticed that. I looked, and she was right. He'd toss a portion wide, away from the cluster of larger birds, toward the runts working the edges. It was such a small thing. I remember thinking, that's a strange thing for a girl to notice, and then thinking nothing more of it, because that's what you do with small things, you let them pass. I want to be honest about something, because this story doesn't work if I smooth it over. I did not like that Josie was drawn to him. Not because of anything he did. Because he was a stranger, and unhoused, and my daughter could not run from anyone, could not stand up and put 6 feet between herself and a threat if I misjudged one, and I had already lost the ability to trust the world to be gentle with the people I loved. So for a long time, our visits to that bench area were shorter than Josie wanted them to be, and I told myself I was protecting her, and maybe I was, and maybe I was also just protecting myself from having to explain, to myself, why a homeless man on a park bench made my daughter's face do something I hadn't seen it do since before Daniel died. That's the part one have to tell you plainly, because it's the part I'm least proud of, and because everything that came later would not make sense without it. My sister, Cammie, came to visit that winter, and she noticed it too, the way people who only see your life in short visits often notice things you've stopped seeing at all. We were sitting on a bench a safe distance from Walter's, watching Josie watch him, and Cammie said, quietly, so Josie wouldn't hear, you let her stare at him like that every day? She's not bothering anyone, I said, which wasn't an answer to what she'd actually asked. That's not what I mean, Ren. I mean, does it worry you? That she's so fixed on him? I remember giving her some deflecting answer about how children get attached to routines after trauma, how Josie's therapist had said as much, how it was probably nothing more than the comfort of a familiar shape in an unfamiliar park, a man who was always there when so much else in her life had stopped being reliable. It was a reasonable answer. It might even have been partly true. But I remember, too, the specific discomfort of saying it, the sense that I was reciting an explanation I'd built for myself rather than one I actually believed, and Cammie looked at me for a beat too long before she let it go, the way people do when they've decided not to push a thing that isn't theirs to push. I didn't have a better answer to give her, because I didn't have one for myself. All I had was the fact of it, that 4 afternoons a week, my daughter, who had stopped reaching for very much of anything in the year since the accident, reached, in her own quiet way, toward a stranger on a bench, and that some part of me flinched from that reaching every single time, without ever once being able to say exactly why. Here is the day. It was a Thursday in April, mild, that specific slant of late afternoon light that makes even ordinary parks look like paintings of themselves. I had wheeled Josie to our usual spot near the fountain, not directly at Walter's bench but close enough, 40 feet or so, the distance I had unconsciously decided was safe. Josie had a book open on her lap she wasn't reading. She was watching him toss bread to the pigeons the way she always did. There was a third person in the park that day who I did not notice at first, because he did not look like someone worth noticing either. That surprises people when I tell them, given who he turned out to be, but it's true, wealth like his doesn't announce itself with a costume. He was a tall man, maybe 50, in a plain gray quarter zip and dark trousers, standing near the hospital side entrance to the park with 2 people in suits a respectful few paces behind him, the kind of posture that says security without saying it aloud. I found out later his name was Marcus Wren, and that he owned, among other things, a controlling share of a company that made cardiac devices used in half the hospitals on the East Coast, and that he was in that park because his foundation had just funded a new pediatric rehabilitation wing at Whitmore Children's, across the street, and he'd stepped outside during a break in the ribbon cutting to get 5 minutes of air before more cameras. None of that mattered yet. What mattered was what happened next, and I have relived it so many times since that I can tell it to you frame by frame, the way you'd describe a dream you've had more than once. Josie went still. Stiller than her usual stillness, the kind of still that made me look up from my phone because a mother learns to read the difference between her child's quiet moods the way you learn to read weather fronts. She was staring at Walter, but not with her usual soft attention. Her whole face had gone open, unguarded, almost frightened, though not frightened of him, frightened of something rising in her own chest that she didn't have a name for. "Mom," she said. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. "Mom, I have to." And then she put both hands on the arms of her wheelchair and pushed herself up. I need you to understand that this had not happened once in 14 months. Not in physical therapy, not with the parallel bars and the harness and a room full of professionals braced to catch her, not once, not for a single second. Her doctors had been careful, always, not to promise anything, using words like incomplete injury and some preserved signal and we can't predict individual outcomes, which I had learned, over a year of appointments, was doctor language for maybe. Someday, we don't know, don't hope too hard. I had stopped hoping too hard. I want to be honest about that too. Somewhere in month 9 or 10, I had quietly, guiltily, filed Josie walking again into the drawer marked things I have to stop wishing for so I can function, and I had not opened that drawer in a long time. She stood. Her legs shook so badly I thought she'd go straight down onto the pavement, and I was already moving, already reaching, my whole body electric with the kind of fear that erases thought. But she didn't go down. She took one step. Then another. Her gait was nothing like a normal 8-year-old's gait, it was lurching, uneven, her right foot dragging slightly with each stride, her arms out at her sides for balance like a much younger child learning to walk for the first time, but it was walking, unmistakably, undeniably, for steps, 5, 6, straight toward the man on the bench, who had gone as still as she had. I was screaming her name. I remember that. I remember the sound of my own voice, high and cracked, not words, just her name over and over, and I remember running, actually running, the first time I had run anywhere in 14 months without a wheelchair between me and wherever I was going, and I remember that I did not reach her before she reached him. She fell the last foot or so, forward, and Walter Voss caught her. He came up off that bench faster than a man his age and his apparent frailty should have been able to move, and he caught my daughter under the arms and lowered her, carefully, onto the grass beside the bench, and he was saying something to her, low, urgent, not panicked. The opposite of panicked, actually, a voice with training in it, a voice that had done this before, whatever this was. Don't lock your knees, sweetheart, that's it, sit back into it, good, breathe with me now, in through your nose, there you go, you're all right, you did it, you're all right. I got to them seconds later, dropped to my knees on the grass, and Josie was crying, not from pain, I understood almost immediately, but from something closer to shock, the kind of full-body sob that comes when something you didn't let yourself hope for actually happens. She was saying my name and his name, except she didn't know his name, she just kept saying I felt him, Mom, I felt like I had to, which made no sense to me in that moment and would make a great deal of sense to me later. That is when I noticed the man in the gray quarter zip. He had crossed the whole width of the park at something between a walk and a run, his 2 suited companions jogging to keep pace, and he arrived at the little scene on the grass, a sobbing 8-year-old, her stunned mother, and a homeless stranger kneeling over both of them with the calm of someone checking a pulse, and he stopped dead. Not out of shock at the miracle, though there was that too. He stopped because he was looking at Walter's face, and something in his own face had gone through several changes in the space of 2 seconds, recognition, disbelief, something that looked almost like grief. Sergeant Voss, he said. I want to tell you. Walter looked up slowly, dramatically, the way it would happen in a film. He didn't. He looked up fast, almost flinching, the way you look up when someone says a name you buried on purpose. You've got the wrong man, Walter said. I don't, said Marcus Wren. His voice was doing something strange, trying to stay level and failing by degrees. I've spent 4 years trying to find you. I put a private investigator on it for 3 of those years. I have a photograph in a drawer in my office of a man carrying me out of a burning vehicle on a road outside Kandahar, and I have looked at that photograph more times than I can tell you, trying to memorize a face I only saw for maybe 90 seconds while I was half conscious, and I am looking at that face right now. I did not understand any of this yet. I was still holding my daughter, who had gone quiet, watching the 2 men with an expression I could not read. All I understood, in that moment, standing on the wet spring grass with paramedics arriving because someone had already called them, was that the homeless man who fed pigeons on a park bench and the wealthy man who had just funded a hospital wing across the street were looking at each other like 2 people meeting a ghost, and that somehow my daughter had walked toward the center of it. The paramedics checked Josie over on the grass, and then again in the ambulance, out of caution, though she insisted she felt fine, just tired, like after running a race, she said, a phrase she had not had occasion to use in over a year and that she said with something like wonder in her own voice, testing it. I rode with her. Walter did not come. I want to be clear about that, because in the version of this story that people like to imagine, everyone piles into one dramatic scene together, and that isn't what happened. Walter stayed in the park. Marcus Wren stayed with him. I did not learn what was said between them until 3 days later, when Marcus Wren came to my house and told me why my daughter had needed, with something in her that had nothing to do with logic, to walk to that man. I should explain who Walter Voss was, because I didn't know, not for a long time, and neither did most of the city that walked past his bench for 2 years without asking his name. 15 years before that Thursday in the park, Walter Voss had been a combat medic, a staff sergeant, attached to a unit doing route clearance work in a province whose name I'll leave out, because it isn't the point and I don't want to misrepresent details that were never mine to know precisely. Marcus Wren, a much younger man then, newly commissioned, had been in a vehicle that hit a roadside device. 2 men in that vehicle died. Marcus did not, because Walter Voss pulled him out through a door that had been bent nearly shut, with the vehicle beginning to burn, and packed a wound in his thigh that would otherwise have killed him from blood loss within minutes, and then went back, alone, for the driver, who did not survive despite what Walter did for him, though not for lack of trying. Marcus Wren left the service with a medical discharge and a debt he described to me, later, sitting at my kitchen table, as the kind you can't repay because the man who's owed doesn't want repaying, he wants to disappear. Walter Voss came home a year after Marcus did. And then, in the particular quiet way that happens to men who carry what he carried, Walter Voss began, slowly, to come apart. I only learned the shape of it secondhand, some from Marcus, more later from Walter himself, in pieces, over months, because Walter was not a man who told his own story easily or all at once, and I've come to respect that about him rather than resent it. His wife, Dolores, had waited the whole deployment and the year after, and by the time Walter came home whole in body he was not whole in the ways that matter for a marriage, or for holding a job, or for sleeping through a night without the specific violence of memory. There was a son, a boy named Peter, 11 years old, who Walter loved in the wordless, overcorrecting way of a man trying to be present for a childhood he'd missed pieces of. 3 years after Walter came home, Peter was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of leukemia. He died 14 months later, at 9 years old, in a hospital room Walter described to me only once, briefly, and never again. Dolores left within the year, not out of cruelty, Walter always insisted, but out of the same drowning that had taken him, 2 people going under in the same water and unable to reach for each other without pulling the other down further. The house went not long after. Walter told me once that he didn't remember making a decision to become homeless, that it happened the way falling happens, a long series of very small failures to catch himself, until one day he woke up on a bench and understood that this, now, was simply where he lived, and that some part of him had chosen it, had wanted the anonymity of it, the way you want silence after a house has been too loud for too long. He told me, once, in a rare unguarded stretch of an afternoon, about the last thing Peter said to him that made any sense as a sentence, near the end, in the hospital, something small, about a television show they used to watch together, half a joke that trailed off before it landed, and how Walter had spent longer than he'd like to admit trying to remember the rest of that joke, because it felt, to him, like the last real thing his son had tried to hand him, and he'd dropped it. You'd think a man trained to keep his head clear under fire could hold on to one sentence, he said. Turns out that's not the kind of thing training helps with. He didn't cry when he told me that. I did, a little, and he seemed almost embarrassed on my behalf, which told me something about how used to holding things alone he'd become. There were people who tried to help him, in those first months on the street, a shelter caseworker named Priya who kept a bed open for him longer than policy technically allowed, an old army buddy who drove 2 states over once to find him and left, Walter said, about as empty-handed as a man can leave, because Walter had told him, plainly, that he wasn't ready, and the friend, to his credit, had believed him rather than argued. Walter didn't resent any of them for trying. He just wasn't, in his own words, available to be found yet. He told me that the bench, and the bread, and the small ritual of giving the runts extra, was the only structure he'd built for himself in 2 years that felt like his rather than something handed to him by someone hoping to fix him, and that he understood, even at the time, that a man can't be talked out of a thing like that. He has to walk out of it himself, in his own hour, and most people who tried to rush that hour only pushed him further from it. He fed the pigeons, he told me later, because Peter used to feed them. It was one of the only rituals from his old life he'd kept, the one thing he let himself carry forward, and he gave the small ones extra because Peter used to insist on it, said it wasn't fair to the little guys. And Walter had never been able to stop doing it, 2 years and 11 months after his son died, because to stop would have meant admitting that even this last small habit could be lost too. Marcus Wren had spent 4 years and, by his own estimate, a genuinely embarrassing amount of money trying to find the man who saved his life, because the not knowing had become its own wound. He had gone to the VA, to unit reunions, to every database a private investigator with resources could access, and he had come up against the particular difficulty of searching for a man who did not want to be found and who had, by the time of the search, no fixed address, no phone, no employer, nothing that leaves a trail. He told me, sitting across my kitchen table 3 days after the park, that he had begun to believe Walter Voss might be dead, and that some part of him had made an uneasy peace with that possibility, because at least it was an answer, and answers, even bad ones, are easier to carry than an open question you turn over every night before sleep. He told me about the photograph too, that afternoon at my kitchen table, though he didn't have it with him, he described it instead, the way you describe something you've looked at so many times you no longer need to see it to see it. A field medic in another unit had taken it, almost by accident, in the chaos after the blast. Walter's face turned half away from the camera, soot-streaked, focused entirely on the weight he was carrying, Marcus limp and pale in his arms. Marcus said he'd had it enlarged once a few years ago, in the early days of the search, hoping some detail, a birthmark, a tattoo, the particular set of a jaw, might help a database do what his memory couldn't. Nothing came of it. He'd kept the photograph anyway, moved it from apartment to office to the house he eventually bought, always in the top drawer of whatever desk he was using that year, because he said he couldn't explain to himself why exactly, only that it felt disrespectful to put it somewhere he wouldn't see it. I built an entire company, he told me, turning his coffee cup slowly on my kitchen table without drinking from it, on devices that keep hearts beating past the point they'd otherwise stop. Do you know why I went into that business? People assume it's because of what he did for me over there. It's not directly. It's because for 4 years after I came home, I understood every single day that I was alive because one man decided, in about 4 seconds, that I was worth going back for, twice, the second time under fire, and I could never find a way to be worthy of that decision that felt like enough. Making machines that do a smaller version of what he did, for strangers, over and over, that was the closest I ever got to answering it. It was never going to be enough. I don't think anything was ever going to be enough. I just didn't expect the debt to still be an open one, 15 years later, sitting on a bench 2 miles from a hospital I'd just put my name on. I didn't know what to say to that, sitting across from a stranger who had, 3 days earlier, been a name in a news story about a ribbon cutting, and who was now telling me, plainly, in my own kitchen, about a debt he'd carried since before I'd met my husband. I remember thinking that grief doesn't care what tax bracket you're in, that a rich man's ledger of what he owes the dead and the barely living looks the same, underneath, as anyone else's. Now here is the part of this that I still find myself circling back to, turning over, unable to fully explain, though I've had a year to sit with it and I've asked 3 different specialists, and none of them will give me a tidy answer, which I've come to think is the honest kind of answer. Josie had never met Walter Voss. Had no knowledge, conscious or otherwise, of his history, his name, his connection to a stranger named Marcus Wren. What Josie had, her neurologist explained to me some weeks later, sitting very carefully on the edge of overpromising, was an incomplete spinal cord injury, meaning some neural pathways below the injury site remained partially intact, carrying weak, inconsistent signal, the kind of thing that shows up faintly on certain scans and means recovery is possible but never guaranteed and never predictable in its timing or its trigger. Extreme emotional or adrenal states, he told me, can in rare, poorly understood cases produce a temporary surge in motor signals strong enough to allow brief function that isn't otherwise available. Not a miracle in the sense of new tissue or new nerves, but an unmasking, briefly, of capacity that had been there, faint and unusable, all along. What I could never get any doctor to explain to me, and what I no longer expect an explanation for, is why that particular afternoon, why that particular man. Josie herself, when I've asked her gently, over many months, to describe what she felt, has only ever been able to offer me a version of what she said in the park. I felt like I had to. Like something in me knew before I did. She has told me, more than once, in the specific unself-conscious way children describe things adults have taught themselves not to trust, that she thinks some part of Peter, a boy she never met, who died 5 years before she was born, was somehow in that feeling. I don't know what to do with that, and I've decided I don't have to do anything with it. I've decided some things get to stay unexplained, and this is one of the ones I've let stay that way. What I do know is what happened over the following months, and that part one can tell you plainly, because I watched it happen with my own eyes, at my own kitchen table, in my own backyard, in the hallways of Whitmore Children's Hospital where Josie began an intensive new round of physical therapy the week after that Thursday, under doctors who were careful, always, not to promise, but who could not keep the cautious excitement fully out of their voices either. Marcus Wren did not try to buy Walter Voss's cooperation, and I want to say that clearly, because it would have been easy for this story to become one about a rich man rescuing a homeless veteran with a checkbook, and that is not what happened, or at least not only what happened, and I think Marcus understood that money offered too quickly, to a man like Walter, would have felt like exactly the kind of transaction Walter had spent 2 years hiding from. What Marcus did, first, was simply show up. He came back to the park the next day, alone, no suits trailing him, and sat on the bench beside Walter, and didn't say anything about hospitals or houses or debts. He brought a paper sack of bread, Walter told me later, with something that might have been the first real laugh I ever heard out of him, like he thought that was the way in. Like I needed a competing bread supplier. But he sat. And he came back the day after that. And the day after that. It took, by Walter's own accounting, 11 days before he agreed to sleep somewhere with a roof, and that was not Marcus's house or a hotel. It was a small VA-affiliated transitional housing program that Marcus's foundation had, as it happened, quietly funded a wing of years before any of this, before he'd ever hoped to find the man he was funding it in memory of, a detail neither of them had known until Marcus went looking for the right kind of help and found his own name already on a plaque. In the lobby. Walter has told me since that this, more than any grand gesture, was what made him trust the offer even a little, that Marcus wasn't trying to hand him a life assembled fresh for the occasion, but pointing him towards something built for men like him before this particular man had a name attached. Those 11 days weren't easy ones, and I don't want to make them sound simpler than they were. Marcus told me, later, that there were 2 nights he genuinely thought he'd lost the thread entirely, one where Walter didn't show up at the bench at all, and Marcus walked half the city before dawn checking underpasses and the loading dock behind the bakery on Kestrel Street, until he found him, finally, sitting against a low wall 2 blocks from the park, not hiding exactly, just needing, Walter told him afterward, a night where nobody was looking at me like I was a problem to be solved. Marcus said he didn't say anything that night. He just sat down on the curb next to him, in a coat that cost more than most of the wall Walter was leaning against, and didn't leave until the sun came up, and didn't ask him to come anywhere. Walter has told me that was the night he started to believe the offer might not be about Marcus needing to feel resolved. It might, instead, actually be about him. Meanwhile, at Whitmore Children's, Josie had started her new round of therapy, and I want to tell you about one particular afternoon there, because it stayed with me the way the park did. Her physical therapist, a patient, unhurried woman named Grace Odom, had Josie in the parallel bars, harnessed in case her legs gave, working through a set of exercises meant to coax out whatever faint signal remained below the injury site. It was slow, unglamorous work, nothing like the park. No sudden rising, just small controlled shifts of weight, over and over, Josie's face set in the particular concentration of a child trying to make her body do something it had forgotten how to promise. Grace never once mentioned the park to her directly during a session, careful, I think, not to let Josie feel she was chasing a repeat of something spontaneous rather than building something durable of her own. The park was her body surprising all of us, Grace told me once, in the hallway, out of Josie's hearing. This is us trying to teach her body to stop needing to be surprised into it. I have held on to that sentence more than almost anything else a doctor has said to me in 2 years. Josie asked to see him again before I'd worked up the nerve to arrange it myself. I took her back to the park on a Sunday, 2 weeks after, in her wheelchair. The brief walking had not repeated itself, and her doctors had been clear that it likely wouldn't, not as a spontaneous thing, not without the long unglamorous work of therapy to slowly, incompletely, coax more of that signal into reliable use. Walter was on his bench. He looked different already, cleaner, in a coat that fit, though his eyes still did that far-off arithmetic when he thought no one was watching. "You gave the little ones extra," Josie said to him, by way of greeting, as if picking up a conversation from a week that had somehow never actually contained a conversation between them. "Still do," Walter said. He looked at me for permission, which I gave him with a nod, still not entirely trusting my own judgment but trusting, at least, my daughter's certainty, which had been more right than mine in every way that mattered so far. Peter used to say it wasn't fair otherwise. "My boy." "I know," Josie said, which she could not have known, not in any way I could account for, and Walter's face did something complicated and quiet that he didn't try to explain either. "I'm not going to tell you that." Josie walked again, permanently, on some tidy schedule that makes for a satisfying ending. "That isn't what happened, and I don't want to give you a story truer than the truth. What happened is slower and, I've come to believe, better, because it's the kind of true that keeps being true after the cameras, and there were, eventually, cameras, because Marcus Wren is not an anonymous man and stories like ours find their way into the world whether you invite them or not, after the cameras leave." Over the following year, with the new round of therapy, with a specialist, Marcus's foundation connected us to who had experience with exactly Josie's rare presentation. She regained partial, inconsistent motor function in both legs. She can, as of the day I'm recording this, stand unassisted for short periods. She can walk short distances with a walker, most days, and on her best days, briefly, without one, though we hold our breath every time, and she still ends up in the chair for anything longer than the length of our front hallway. Her doctors still won't promise more than that, and I've stopped needing them to. I opened the drawer marked things I have to stop wishing for so I can function, finally, all the way, and I let myself want this again, whatever this turns out to mean over the years still ahead of her. Walter Voss is not homeless anymore. He has a small apartment 2 miles from Whitmore Park, and a part-time position, arranged quietly through the VA program and not through any largesse of Marcus's that Walter would have refused, working with newly discharged veterans navigating the same transition he nearly didn't survive. He still feeds the pigeons most Thursdays. He gives the small ones extra. Josie and I meet him there some afternoons, not every week, not as some scheduled ritual that would make the whole thing feel arranged rather than real, but often enough that it has become, in its own unhurried way, a kind of family, not the kind you're born into, the other kind, the kind that gets built out of a debt nobody can repay and a girl who felt something she couldn't explain and trusted it anyway. Marcus Wren and Walter Voss see each other now too, and I understand from what little either of them has told me that most of what passes between them still isn't spoken directly, that the years of not knowing, and then the strange overwhelming fact of finding each other, is not a thing two men like that resolve with speeches. Marcus told me once, the only time he's ever gotten close to saying it plainly, that he doesn't think of what he's done as repayment, because a debt like that isn't the kind that gets settled with money or housing or hospital wings. It just gets carried differently, more lightly, alongside people rather than alone. I think that's true of most of what mattered in this story. Nothing got settled, exactly. It just got carried differently. Cammy came to visit again this past winter, almost exactly a year after that conversation on the park bench where she'd asked me, gently, whether Josie's fixation on a stranger worried me. We sat on that same bench, and Josie was up near the fountain with her walker, closer to Walter's bench than my old safe distance had ever allowed, laughing at something he'd said. Cammy watched them for a while without saying anything, and then she said, "You were so scared of this, that winter." "I know," I said. "What were you scared of, exactly?" "Do you know now?" I thought about it longer than the question probably deserved. I think I was scared that if I let myself believe there was something to her reaching toward him, I'd have to believe in things I'd stopped letting myself believe in. That some part of a person can know something before the rest of them catches up. That the worst year of your life might still be quietly rearranging itself into something you couldn't see the shape of yet. I watched Josie reach out and steady herself on the back of Walter's bench, unhurried, sure of her balance in a way she hadn't been in years. I didn't want to be wrong about hoping for that. It felt safer to just not hope. Cammy didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She just reached over and took my hand, the way you do when someone has finally said the true thing out loud instead of the reasonable one, and we sat there together and watched my daughter stand, unassisted, in the last of the afternoon light, talking to a man who fed the small pigeons extra because his son once told him it wasn't fair otherwise. I think about that Thursday in April more than I think about almost anything else in my life, including, I'll admit, more than I sometimes think about the accident that started all of this, which surprised me when I first noticed it and doesn't anymore. I don't have an explanation for why my daughter, paralyzed for 14 months, stood up in a public park and walked toward a stranger she had never met, who turned out to be tied by an old, silent debt to a man building a hospital wing across the street. I've made a kind of peace with not having the explanation. Some things, I've decided, don't need to be solved to be real. They just need to be carried, the way Walter carried a stranger out of a burning vehicle 15 years ago without stopping to work out the odds, the way Marcus carried an unpayable debt for 4 years without knowing if the man he owed it to was even alive, the way I've carried a wheelchair and a walker and, some days now, nothing at all, just my daughter's hand in mine, walking slowly, unevenly, forward. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.